This is a lecture on Samuel Clarke's Cosmological argument. I'm Dan Yackel, but my understanding of this argument comes from William Rowe, who happens to be a graduate of Wayne State University and has a PhD from University of Michigan. The argument we're presenting comes from Samuel Clarke. Samuel Clarke is an English theologian who lived in the late 16 and early 1700s. A few definitions first. A dependent being is a being that's dependent, at least in part, on something else for its existence. On the other hand, a self-existent being is a being that's entirely responsible for its own existence. That is, it's not dependent on anything else. Here are two more definitions. Mutually exclusive sets have no members in common. They don't overlap. Jointly exhaustive sets include everything. For example, the prime natural numbers and the composite natural numbers are jointly exhaustive. They include all the natural numbers. There aren't any natural numbers that aren't either prime or composite. Those two sets are also mutually exclusive, since there's no natural number that's both prime and composite. Here's the cosmological argument according to Clarke. Every being there is either dependent or self-existent. Premise 2 says not every being is dependent. It follows that there is a self-existent being. If all the beings are dependent or self-existent, but they're not all dependent, then there must be at least one self-existent being. The argument seems to be valid. Is the conclusion substantial? The conclusion doesn't say that God exists. But notice, if there is a self-existent being, then it's a being that explains entirely its own existence. No natural things are like that. So this being is a supernatural being, and it would have to be immensely powerful to account for its own existence. So the conclusion is significant. Premise 1 says every being is either dependent or self-existent. That is, Premise 1 says those two categories are jointly exhaustive. There's nothing that's neither dependent or self-existent. Which of these four possibilities is ruled out by Premise 1? Remember, Premise 1 said every being is either dependent or self-existent. You can pause and think it over. Look at possibility number 2. See that X in there? If that X is not dependent or self-existent, then possibility 2 is ruled out by premise 1. What about possibility number 4? Is that ruled out by premise 1? The answer is no. Is that being, the red circled being, either dependent or self-existent? It is. What about that being? Is that either dependent or self-existent? It is. What about that being? Is it either dependent or self-existent? Yes again, and so on for all the items in possibility 4. It's not premise 1 that rules out possibility 4, it's premise 2. Premise 2 says not every being is dependent. That is, they can't all be dependent. This is the big premise. This is the one that's going to rule out the infinite chain, which you'll remember is a string of only dependent beings. Maybe Aquinas can help with the proof of this premise. Aquinas' third way argument might be useful. Aquinas uses different terminology in his third way argument, but I've put it into Paley's language here. All dependent beings must come into existence at some time because they can't be eternal. If they depend on something else for their existence, there had to be something else to bring them into existence. If a being is dependent, then it must have a start date. If we go back far enough, we'll get to a beginning point for dependent being. Now what if they were only dependent beings? If each of those dependent beings has a start date, then if we go back far enough, we'll get to a point before which any dependent being existed. Remember, we're assuming that there are only dependent beings. Since dependent beings require something else for their existence, no dependent beings could arise from nothing. So there can't be only dependent beings. There's a problem with that reasoning. Sentence 2 doesn't follow from sentence 1. But why isn't that argument valid? Is there a way for 1 to be true without 2? The fact that each dependent being has a start date, or came into existence at some time, does not apply that all dependent beings together have a start date, or that if you go back far enough, you'll get to a time where there was nothing. For example, what if this dependent being was brought into existence by one before it, and that dependent being was preceded by one before it, and that dependent being was preceded by one before it, and so on forever. The error in my presentation of the argument is called fallacy of composition. That's the mistake of thinking that if something is true for every member of a group, then it must be true for the group as a whole. For example, the fact that each human being has a mother doesn't imply that all humanity has a mother. Aquinas didn't really make the fallacy of composition mistake. He didn't forget about the infinite chain or fail to see it as a counterexample. He just thought the infinite chain was impossible and he didn't have to worry about it. But Clarke is trying to show that it's impossible, so he can't use Aquinas' argument that assumes it is. Clarke needs his own argument for premise 2. Enter Leibnitz and the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason says there's an explanation for the existence of everything and the truth of every positive fact. By explanation, we don't mean known explanation. There are some things that are just inexplicable, like the fashion choices of the early 1990s or crop circles. But the fact that we don't know what the explanation is for these things doesn't mean that they don't have explanations in Leibniz's sense. We think that there is an explanation for the crop circles, even if we're not sure what it is. Leibniz gives two arguments for the principle of sufficient reason. Even if you don't accept Leibniz's two arguments for the principle of sufficient reason, you might accept the principle anyway. Anything that happens, you think, has a reason for its happening. Maybe not a grand plan for its happening, but if you were all-knowing and somebody asked you why it happened, you could give an answer. How does the principle of sufficient reason help with Clarke's argument? Look at premise 1 first. Remember, that says every being is dependent or self-existent. A self-existent being is fully explained by itself, and a dependent being is partially explained by something else. But a being that's neither dependent nor self-existent wouldn't be explained by anything. Of course, the principle of sufficient reason part 1 rules that out. There's an explanation for everything. As an aside, see if you can say why Aquinas would have to disagree with the principle of sufficient reason part 1 and with Clarke's first premise. On to premise 2. Not every being is dependent. The only possibility for every being to be dependent is the infinite chain. But Clarke says the infinite chain would contradict the principle of sufficient reason part 2. Why would there be an infinite chain of dependent beings, if there were one? It is true that every being in the chain is explained, perhaps by the being before it, but Clarke says that wouldn't explain why there is a chain at all. In response, pretend I have $7 in my pocket, and you ask me to explain where they came from. I might respond that I have $2 left over from my last paycheck. My wife gave me $4 for lunch today, and I found $1 on the sidewalk this morning. I've explained each of the dollars in my pocket. Is there anything left for me to explain? If you now ask me to explain all $7, would I have more to say? No, I would just say I already explained them all. Here's another example. Suppose I've asked you, the class, to explain why you've enrolled in the class, and pretend you've all answered thoroughly. One of you says you needed the class to graduate and it fit your schedule. Another of you says your counselor signed you up for it. Another of you says that the description looked interesting and your friend was taking the class, or whatever. Pretend you all answer my question. Now, would it be reasonable for me to ask why you've all enrolled in the class? Now that I've heard why each of you enrolled, why did you all enroll? That's a silly question, right? You just explained it to me. There's nothing else to explain. Now back to the infinite chain. Someone responding to Clarke in defense of the infinite chain might say, each member of the infinite chain of dependent beings is explained by the one before. There's no further explanation to give. Now you ask me to explain why there's a chain at all, or ask me to explain the whole chain? I just did. I explained each member, and there's nothing left to explain. There are three possible ways to respond to this argument. You might have noticed that Clarke's critic is saying that each member is explained, so they're all together explained. That sounds like the fallacy of composition again. But it's not necessarily. Notice that some features compose and some don't. For example, if every component of a toy weighs more than 1 pound, then altogether the components weigh more than 1 pound. That's no fallacy. But what if I tried this argument? If every component of the toy weighs less than 1 pound, then it doesn't follow that altogether the components weigh less than 1 pound. That would be a mistake. So the question here is whether is explained composes or not. Another possible response is to criticize the analogies. You could say that the analogies are dissimilar enough to the infinite chain that what we conclude about the money or what we conclude about the class shouldn't be applied to the chain. For example, Clarke could say the chain is infinite and the $7 or however many dollars are not. Also, the classroom is not infinite. The chain is. Also, the explanations of the dollars and the class members appeal to something outside the set. I couldn't explain how I got $7 in my pocket without appealing to something outside my pocket. Also, you can't explain why you're taking the class without appealing to something outside the class. That's not true of the explanation offered by the defenders of the infinite chain. This line of response results in a disagreement about whether the differences are relevant. We'll talk more about evaluating analogies soon, but this response also is inconclusive. Here's a third possible response. It's the one that Clarke actually gives. He gives another analogy. If a chain were hanging in the center of campus and there were no end of it in sight, no matter how high up we went and looked, would you be satisfied with my explaining the chain this way? You see, the bottom link is being held up by the link above it, and that link's being held up by the link above it, and so on forever. Is that a satisfying explanation of the infinite chain? Or would you laugh me off and ask somebody else to explain it? The cosmological argument seems to come down to whether the explanation of each is the explanation of all, or whether the principle of sufficient reason is true.